Right, next thing is to pop the drive shaft on here. Because it's a shaft drive bike, there's no chain. There's a flange at the back of the gearbox there, if you can see that. There's a flange there that meets it. So if you can offer that up, I've got these 4 special bolts, which will pop in to hold it all together. Now these are actually special high tensile bolts, and it's quite important that you use the genuine ones rather than something from the hardware shop. And what we're going to do then is assemble the whole rear suspension around the drive shaft. Now this is probably the easiest way to build the bike, but if you were just doing some servicing or maintenance work on it, you wouldn't have to strip all the back end off to get to this. Right, that's the drive shaft assembly in place. What I want to do now is have a go offering the swing arm in, but just before we do that, the swinging arm bearings need to go into there. And here we've got a taper roller bearing on each side. I've got new bearings and I've put fresh grease on them. If you pop that over, and there's the other one. And these are the bearings that the whole rear suspension pivots on. Lovely. Okay. If you can slide that in now, what we need to do is offer the drive shaft through there. And it can rattle on the inside of the swing arm, that's not too much of a problem. And that hopefully will now clear those bolts and sit into the frame. This job really is much easier if there are 2 people to do it. It can be quite tricky if you're doing this alone, because these parts are quite large and heavy, and it does require a little bit of waggling. Now, if you have had parts powder coated, it's wise to be aware that that can add an extra thickness of coating to the metal, and sometimes that'll need dressing up with a file before everything will quite slot together smoothly. In this case, we just had to persuade the swing arm a little bit before it's finally slotted into place. Right, that's the swing arm in place, but just to support it now, what we really need is a shock absorber on this side. If you have that one handy, that's great, and that should just slide over the top there and hook into that eye. Look at that, looks like it was made for it. Now that's the suspension fitted and connected up, but of course this bike shouldn't have 1 shock absorber, it should have 2. But we've still got all the drive assembly to go on here for the shaft drive, and the other shock absorber fits onto that. So what we've got next is this great big lump here. And this mammoth part of the machine is actually the rear drive for the wheel, and this is what converts the rotation of the shaft drive into the rotation for the wheel. I'm afraid I have rather a bad habit of referring to this as a differential, but of course any engineer will know that it isn't. It's merely a crown and pinion assembly, but nonetheless it's a beautiful piece of engineering. If I can hook that in there, and the idea is hopefully we can engage that onto the end of the drive shaft. And again, this is simply because we're assembling this in a slightly different sequence to if you were doing this as part of a maintenance routine. There we go, that's in. And now, I may just have to rotate that to engage it on the splines on the drive shaft. And eventually, that'll hook into place and it'll just bolt up. All right, just have to feed these in by hand, but then that's the rear drive assembly in place. And that's how your shaft drive works. So it is a rather more complicated setup than with a chain, but of course once it's in place and set up, you don't need to do any maintenance with this at all, and it should run quite reliably for many, many years. The other advantage with shaft drive as well, of course, is that there's nothing to adjust, so you don't have to keep moving the wheel backwards in the suspension to reset your chain tension. Yes. And that has effects on the way the bike handles. It's because nothing on the steering geometry of the bike changes when you make adjustments. And that's it for part 1. Come back and join us in part 2 when hopefully all the rest of the bike will be built.